It happened here, on this very ziggurat in southern Iraq, today buried beneath 2,000 years of dirt and sand. But 2,500 years ago, this temple pyramid represented the heart of the magnificent city of Babylon and was the site of a historic event. On October 29, 539 BCE, the city below was covered as far as the eye could see with a constantly moving mass of people, waiting in anxious anticipation for the man who had just conquered them. They were the unfortunate victims of war who had assembled here to finally learn what their new master had in store for them. Ordinarily, their toppled king suffered a slow, agonizing death. Women raped. Those lucky enough to escape death were deported into slavery and their city burnt to the ground. It was a conqueror's customary right, known as victor's justice. But this was no ordinary conqueror. No, this victor's reputation for amnesty and reconciliation had preceded him. But in a time before reliable news, no one really knew what to expect. As he emerged from his chariot and climbed the stairs, his nervous audience erupted into a roar of applause, perhaps intended less as cheers of support as they were cries for mercy. As he began to speak, the crowd fell silent. As he had done so many times before, this conqueror would not betray the hopes of his new subjects. He began by doing something unheard of in the ancient world. He paid homage to their Babylonian god, Marduk. Then, in a single fleeting breath, he ordered the release of hundreds of thousands of Babylonian slaves, including some 100,000 Jews from 60 years of Babylonian servitude. He declared everyone's right to worship whatever god they chose and to live wherever they chose. This was the revolutionary decree of Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. The event marked such a radical break with the traditional victor's justice that it was captured twice in the Hebrew Bible.
The Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. Ezra chapter 1.
And in writing it was put indeed. In 1887, during excavations at the ruins of Babylon, this baked clay cylinder was found. Etched into its side was nothing less than an actual contemporary account of Cyrus's famous Babylonian address. Today, a life-size replica of this cylinder sits in the halls of the United Nations building in New York City. Here, according to the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, Shashi Tharoor, it's recognized as history's first known charter of human rights and serves as a constant reminder to all nations of man's basic right to freedom.
We're very proud to have this Edict of Cyrus here at the United Nations. Here we have the world's oldest human rights declaration, which was proclaimed by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. And for us, it was rather important to have this because it stands in a very prominent place on the second floor of the United Nations building, right between the Security Council and the Economic and Social Council. So that, in fact, diplomats walking to these two chambers who are dealing with issues of life and death and war and peace and human rights can see it, sometimes pause and seek inspiration from it. Human rights have their roots in all countries in the world, and Cyrus has stood up and demonstrated that in the Middle East, in Iran, and in fact he issued this after conquering Babylon, that the basic decencies that all human beings have, the rights that human beings have merely because they are human, those go back into other cultures and other civilizations, and they go back a very long time.
So why should this Eastern conqueror be of interest to the West? Because Cyrus may have had a very real influence on Western democracy. In fact, America's Constitution could be considered a very Persian document. 2 books were required reading for early nation builders. Machiavelli's The Prince, which advocates a government based on fear and deceit. And in stark opposition stood Xenophon's Cyropaedia, or The Education of Cyrus, which argues that government should be benevolent and just, as exemplified by Cyrus's rule.
Xenophon was certainly a required reading for would-be world rulers. Xenophon was, of course, creating not a work of entertainment, but a work of education. It was, of course, titled The Education of Cyrus. It was meant as a treatise for the training of princes. It was essentially a manual for statesmanship, for rulership, somewhat like Machiavelli's The Prince in its content. But Machiavelli did famously say that it is better to be feared than loved, whereas the Cyrus of Xenophon's Cyropaedia would say that it is better to be loved than feared.
Today, some half a dozen copies of this classic instruction manual can be found here at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. This was but one of Thomas Jefferson's personal copies of Xenophon's Cyropaedia. Judging by the U.S. Bill of Rights, there can be little doubt whose path the framers of America's Constitution chose to follow. But Cyrus wasn't just admired as a great ruler. He was the first of history's great conquerors. His battles are still taught at U.S. military academies to this day. Alexander, Caesar, considered him a brilliant military mind.
In fact, Alexander is known to have visited Cyrus's tomb on at least 2 occasions, offering sacrifices to the hero whose empire he had just conquered.
So with so many films about Julius Caesar and Alexander, why has a factual film about the founder of the mighty Persian Empire never been made? Some have called it a Western bias, that the European story begins with Greece.
In the West, we're taught early on that the Persian Empire was a ruthless power bent on enslaving all of Greece.
In tales such as the Battle of Marathon or the Battle of Thermopylae, classical Greek authors repeatedly cast the Persians as barbaric tyrants. But were they, really?
The fact is, history is always written by the victor.
But now, my cameraman and I have retraced Cyrus's footsteps through 5 different countries and interviewed dozens of world-renowned scholars to bring this towering figure back to life in a documentary film aptly named In Search of Cyrus the Great. Using the latest scientific data and the most reliable classical sources, history's most celebrated ruler can finally be resurrected from the ash heap of history to reclaim his rightful place among the pantheon of great leaders. Long overdue, this documentary film comes on the heels of Britain's most expensive independent feature film ever produced. Oscar-nominated director Alex Jovie is creating an $80 million epic about this Eastern knight who changed the West forever.
In a nutshell, it's a great epic based on one of the greatest rulers of history. It's kind of forgotten by mankind, nothing much is known about him in the Western world, but Cyrus was a ruler who accepted all cultures, tolerated all religions, and so that was one of the reasons why we kind of put it together.
History matters. So perhaps now, through the power of film, we can finally set the historical record straight.